Chapter 10. A Curious Alligator. As Nancy's friends on the showboat watched, she picked up a glittering object from a crack between the deck boards. It was a large, gold, ornamental hairpin, old-fashioned in design. Tiny diamonds and emeralds sparkled from the fan-shaped end, which was about 2 inches wide. "The gold is still shiny," Nancy observed, scrutinizing the pin. "So this probably hasn't been here very long." Bess and George, too, were intrigued. "You mean the pin might have been dropped here recently by its owner?" asked George. As Nancy nodded, the girls noticed a strange expression come over Charles Bartolome's face. He had been staring intently for several minutes at the hairpin. "Do you know who the owner is?" George asked him. "Possibly," the young man replied after a long moment of silence. "A few months ago, Mrs. Haver showed me her collection of old jewelry. There was a hairpin exactly like this one among the pieces." The girls were stunned by this information. It was incredible, they thought, that Mrs. Haver would have worn the ornament to the showboat. Then who had? "Have you any theory as to how the pin got here?" Nancy asked Charles. "Perhaps someone stole it from Mrs. Haver and dropped it accidentally," he offered. Bess was inclined to think that the pin might not have been dropped accidentally. Perhaps someone planted it here on purpose. "But why?" George asked. Since no one could even attempt to solve the riddle at the moment, the subject was dropped. Nancy pocketed the hairpin with the thought of questioning Mrs. Haver about it later. The young detective now asked Charles if he had heard any bird calls earlier. "You mean the wild ducks that were answering each other?" "Yes, only according to Uncle Rufus, they weren't genuine calls. He suggested that some boys were playing a game, but we girls thought that perhaps someone might be spying on the showboat. A Confederate some distance away could have been using the call to warn someone that we were approaching." Charles frowned. "That could be true. If so, I don't like it at all. I must admit my work kept me so busy that I didn't notice anyone around." Next, Nancy told the young architect about the vine barrier in the stream. "This is serious," he said. "I'll ask Uncle Rufus to search the swamp." He called down softly to Uncle Rufus, requesting him to hunt for any persons who might be watching the group on the boat. As the old man nodded and paddled off, Nancy suggested that the rest of them make certain no one was hiding on the boat itself. The searchers separated, with Charles offering to go down into the hold of the vessel to find out if anyone were there. Nancy took the dressing rooms and upper deck, Bess the auditorium, and George the stage. A thorough search was made. Doors to rooms and closets creaked on their hinges as they were opened, but all were empty except for spider webs. Bess, after looking in the theater, wandered along one of the nearby corridors. With a start, she suddenly saw a reflection in a full-length mirror on the wall ahead of her. The frame was tarnished with age, and the figure looked wavery. "Oh!" she cried with a little shiver. Then, realizing the reflection was her own, she ran out on deck. "This is positively the spookiest place I've ever been in," she said to Nancy, who had just come down from investigating the lookout and second deck. Soon George joined them, then Charles. All reported there was no evidence that anyone besides themselves was aboard. A few moments later, Uncle Rufus returned. He reported that there was no one within 100 yards of the River Princess. "I sure did look sharp every which way," the elderly man assured them. Then he added that he must leave soon. "We'll be ready in a few minutes," Nancy told him. She turned to Charles and asked him if he had ever been on the showboat after dark. "No, I haven't," he said. "In fact, I've never even been in the bayou after sundown." Then, reading Nancy's thoughts, he asked, "Would you girls like to visit the River Princess some evening with me?" "Oh, we'd love to," Nancy replied. Charles Bartolome offered to bring them to the showboat the following evening. Bess did not look enthusiastic, but managed to smile feebly. George declared it would be an interesting adventure. "Maybe after dark we'll be able to scare up those showboat spooks," she said. At this, Bess's faint smile faded completely. She threw a withering glance at her cousin and said, "Don't sound so happy about it. If we do come across any ghosts, you can catch them all, George Fane." Nancy, George, and Charles chuckled. Then Nancy said, "It will be a wonderful trip. And Charles, if you don't mind, I'd like to keep it a secret." He grinned, gave the girls a wink, and said, "I understand, and I'm very flattered that you're going to permit me to help you solve the mystery." "It may be a long pull," Nancy warned him. Charles said he realized that. "But if it isn't solved by Mardi Gras time, I guess there won't be much use." After Nancy and her friends had climbed down the ladder and were seated in the canoe, he called to them, "How about you girls coming to my home to dinner tomorrow evening before we go? I know Mother would like very much to meet you. Dad would too, but he's away for a few days." "That's very kind," said Nancy. "I'd love to come." "I'd be thrilled," Bess spoke up, and George added her thanks. "Then Mother will be calling you," Charles promised. The girls waved goodbye as Uncle Rufus started paddling down the stream. On the return trip, he entertained them with stories of Negro life in Africa centuries ago. "It was my ancestors that invented the first long-distance communication," he said proudly. "We made drums that could carry sounds for miles and miles. The folks in one place sent signals and messages by beating on the drums with their hands. Then the next village would pick it up and send the signal on to another place far away. That's how they all got the members of a tribe together for special meetings and for fighting wars." "Very ingenious," George remarked. Not once did Uncle Rufus refer to voodooism or to the fact that he himself was a voodoo doctor or preacher. Just before the canoe reached the area in the stream where it joined the cleared section, the craft floated over a large pad of white lilies. "Aren't they pretty?" Bess asked. Nancy nodded and decided to pick a few of the flowers to take to Mrs. Haver. In pulling the first one, she felt the whole root coming away. She yanked at it hard and in a moment felt the clump pull loose. The same instant, Bess, who was watching her chum, screamed. She had seen the snout of an alligator rising from beneath the leaves. The reptile's jaws were aiming for Nancy's hand. "Look out!" Bess yelled. End of Chapter 10.